As more Democrats pile on embattled Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, Maryland Democratic Representative Glenn Ivey has become the first House Democrat to openly suggest it's time for Schumer to step down. NewsNation's Joe Khalil has details on a party divided over the best way forward.
Drew, it's sort of a tale of two town halls here that we've been seeing. The pattern, the through line is frustration among voters. Let's start on the Republican side. Yet again, we've got a Republican member doing a town hall where voters are frustrated over DOGE and the prospect of cuts. This time in Nebraska, Congressman Mike Flood facing angry, frustrated voters, worried, many of them expressing concerns that Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security may end up being cut in some way after Elon Musk's interview on another network where he suggested that entitlements have to be under the DOGE microscope. Now, on the Democratic side, you've got something similar. A lot of really frustrated Democratic voters worried that their elected leaders are simply not doing enough to push back on what they perceive as a Trump administration that is getting a series of wins. And in this case, it was Congressman Glenn Ivey from Maryland. He held a town hall where, again, that frustration boiled over, particularly concerns that Ivey, among others, wasn't fighting hard enough and that he wants leader Chuck Schumer over in the Senate to step down. Glenn Ivey sending us this statement saying in some cases he's going to agree with these voters, specifically when it comes to Schumer. Here's what he told us, quote, "I respect Chuck Schumer. I think he had a great long-standing career. He did a lot of great things, but I'm afraid it may be time for Senate Democrats to get a new leader." Now, Ivey is not one to throw bombs, or he's usually someone who isn't as animated as maybe some other members in the House Democratic Conference. Nonetheless, he is not the only elected Democrat who has now said that it is time for Chuck Schumer to move on and pass the torch to perhaps a younger Democrat who is more prepared and ready to fight back against an emboldened Trump administration. Drew.
NewsNation's Joe Khalil, thank you. President Trump boasted on the campaign trail that he was the candidate of peace who would quickly bring an end to wars in the Middle East and Ukraine. Events around the globe this week show how difficult it will be to deliver on those promises. The war in Ukraine rages on despite the Trump administration's push for a ceasefire. In Gaza, fighting resumed yesterday after the collapse of a ceasefire agreement that Trump helped negotiate. Joining us to discuss this and more, Niall Stanage, White House columnist here at The Hill. Now let's start in Ukraine. Trump spoke with Zelensky for about an hour today. He says it was a very good call and they are very much on track. On track for what?
Well, that's the question, because there are a very limited number of specifics about exactly what is being discussed here. I think in big picture terms, the assumption is that President Trump is going to push the Ukrainians to give up pretty significant concessions in order to make peace. Volodymyr Zelensky, obviously for understandable reasons, is reluctant to do that. So we have this assertion that there are good vibes here, but not too much in terms of detail.
Trump spoke with Putin yesterday. Putin didn't agree to the 30-day ceasefire that Trump had proposed. Instead, he wants a much more limited proposal that specifically deals with energy infrastructure. Meanwhile, fighting continues, both sides reportedly targeting each other's infrastructure. Do you think there's been any progress on what Trump and the administration says it wants, which is a permanent end to the war that maintains the sovereignty of Ukraine?
Not really, because one of Putin's talking points here is that there should be a cessation of international support for Ukraine as part of an ultimate end to the war, and the Ukrainians believe that if that were to happen, they would be a sitting duck without the protection to repel any further Russian incursions. In addition to that, obviously Russia holds about 1/5 of the whole territory of Ukraine right now. Are they going to withdraw from that territory? That seems unlikely in the current circumstances. So that in itself would traduce Ukrainian sovereignty.
Yeah, that ask ending foreign support for Ukraine and intelligence sharing seems like a non-starter, not only for Ukraine, but also for Europe, and I would think the vast majority of members of Congress in the U.S.
Well, you would think, though, of course, Republican members of Congress have become much more aligned with President Trump's view, whether you term that America First or isolationist or whatever. It is plainly a break with the widely held view in Europe that there is a multinational interest in rebuffing Putin's invasion of Ukraine. That is what we're seeing right now, the Europeans trying to figure out if there's some way that they can shore up Ukraine when it seems very likely that President Trump and the United States will not.
On the heels of all this, we get this Reuters exclusive that several U.S. national security agencies have stopped efforts to counter Russian cyber attacks. Critics of Trump will say this is another capitulation of Putin.
They will. And I mean, it is a fascinating story from Reuters citing 11 officials or people with knowledge of this matter. And the argument is that the National Security Council is both ceasing to sort of quarterback cooperations between US intelligence agencies and has paused collaboration with European allies on this question. Now, obviously, to skeptics of President Trump, this will fit very much into the narrative that he is too inclined to peddle a rather soft line with Russia.
Let's talk about Gaza. Israel has resumed attacks in Gaza. Hundreds of civilians have been killed. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has promised to continue fighting until all goals of Israel are reached, including the complete elimination of Hamas. The Trump administration crowed after it reached the initial ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas back in January. Phase 1 was implemented. There were some hostages exchanged for Palestinian prisoners. Seems like then the Trump administration kind of lost interest.
Well, I think it's certainly lost interest in pressing Israel to make concessions. Back in that initial phase that you talked about, Drew, there were attempts, I think, by the Trump administration to get the Israelis to sign up and to put some pressure on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. That has effectively disappeared more recently. We've had President Trump talking about hell to pay and unleashing everything if Hamas does not give up the remaining hostages. It is worth noting that the original ceasefire deal had a second phase where, yes, it would be working toward the hostage release if there were a more permanent cessation on Israel's part. That bargain appears to have broken down.
And reportedly, Trump gave the green light to Netanyahu to continue these operations. Does he run any risk of, not fulfilling promises to be the peace candidate when it comes to this major escalation?
I'm not sure that, to be fair, there is a great political risk to him there, because I'm not persuaded that the people who voted for President Trump would blame him for that. People will have the strongly held views that they hold on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and on this recent wave of attacks from the Israelis, but I'm not convinced that they will blame Trump for that.
Here's an interesting and controversial question. Will Donald Trump run again in 2028? The Constitution says no. Trump loyalist Steve Bannon seems to disagree. He was on with NewsNation's Chris Cuomo yesterday. Let's take a listen.
I'm a firm believer that President Trump will run and win again in 2028. So I've already endorsed President Trump. A man like this comes along once every century if we're lucky. We've got him now. He's on fire, and I'm a huge supporter. Want to see him again in 2028.
Bannon says he's working on a plan that involves the definition of term limits. Is there anything to that, or is this just Bannon trying to make headlines and win favor with Trump?
I think the latter is part of it. I think it is partly about winning favor in the court of Trump. It's plainly unconstitutional to run for a third term in the circumstances that we see now with President Trump. To amend the Constitution like that would require widespread ratification by the vast majority of states, including those states that have Democratic governors and legislatures. It's extraordinarily unlikely to happen.
Attorney General Pam Bondi has labeled Tesla vandalism domestic terrorism. She's promising severe punishment for those involved. Several Tesla facilities around the country have been targeted over the past several days. That's obviously wrong, but it does highlight the level of anger being directed at Musk. Customers also speaking with their wallets. Tesla sales are down, stock prices down. There's an interesting experiment going on right here, and that is, can an expensive electric car company survive when the CEO becomes the face of of global right-wing politics?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. The Tesla stock price has declined precipitously, almost 50% in the last month. Now, there are some legitimate business reasons for that, like a rival company in China making strides and so on and so forth. But the point of it is that Tesla, because of its obvious identification with Elon Musk, has also become identified with Elon Musk's rhetoric and approach and political views. Those are views that alienate at least half the country, alienate a lot of people in Europe, where Tesla's sales are falling very sharply in Germany, for example. So I think there are real business ramifications for Tesla.
Probably alienate a lot of people that are the type to buy expensive
That's true.
electric
Absolutely.
cars. Before I let you go, let's talk about the JFK files. A lot of hype and a lot of build-up anticipation. Is there anything that you saw that you found particularly interesting?
I didn't really see any big revelation. A lot of these documents have been in the public domain to some extent before. There have been some minor redactions that have been lifted, but I didn't see one single massive revelation from them.
I'm sure the conspiracies will continue
Sure.
yet. We'll leave it at that. Niall Stanage, thanks so much. A federal judge in D.C. has temporarily blocked the Environmental Protection Agency from taking back billions of dollars in climate grants. The grants are part of a larger $20 billion climate program implemented during the Biden presidency. The Trump administration says the money falls into the category of waste, fraud, and abuse. The money is restored for now after Judge Tanya Chutkan found the agency was unable to provide evidence of wrongdoing. Under Chutkan's order, the termination of the grants cannot take effect and the funds cannot be transferred anywhere. EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin has since vowed to continue fighting to take the money back. NASA astronauts Bush Wilmore and Suni Williams had a warm welcome back to Earth after spending 9 months in space. The surprise guests on the welcoming committee? Dolphins. The friendly marine mammals, greeted the astronauts after splashdown, meeting the SpaceX crew members after their mission to retrieve the stranded astronauts. The pod of dolphins surfaced several times around the Dragon capsule, a memorable end to the long-awaited return of Wilmore and Williams. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.